My name is George Hall, and this lecture is part of the course, A Fiscal History of the United States. This lecture is a primer on call options and callable bonds. In the first part of this lecture, I explain how a call option works and how to compute its value using contingent claims. In the second part, I explain how a callable bond works. So a call option is a derivative security, since its payoff depends, or in other words, derives its value from another underlying asset. In particular, we're going to think about American call options, which grant the holder or the purchaser of the call the right or the option to purchase the underlying asset at a predetermined exercise or strike price on or before a preset maturity date. An option is an exchange between two parties, and options, like most derivatives, allow these two parties to buy and sell risk. And because they allow them the exchange of risk, they're very useful for hedging purposes and for speculation. Okay, so the seller or the writer of the call is the one who grants this option. So they're the one who grants the option to purchase the underlying asset at a preset strike price. And in exchange for granting this option, they receive a premium or payment for doing so. So the writer receives a premium and then grants the option. The buyer or the holder then purchases the option from the writer and has to pay that premium. The holder is placing a bet that the price of the underlying asset will rise. The seller of the option is placing a bet that the price of the underlying asset will not rise. So to think about the payoff of the option, let's think about the payoff of a simple call option at expiration. Okay, we're going to denote the price of the underlying asset by ST, and then the exercise or strike price by X. Now for the call holder, the person who owns the call option, their payoff at expiration is the difference between the asset price and the strike price if the asset price exceeds the strike price. The payoff is 0 if the asset price is below or at the strike price. So then the profit that the call holder, the owner of the call, receives is then this payoff minus the premium that the call holder had to pay to the writer when the holder initially purchased the call option. The payoff and profits to the call writer, to the other person, the other party in this exchange, is just the mirror image of this payoff and profit from the call holder. In this case, the payoff is the negative of the difference between the asset price and the strike price if the asset price exceeds the strike price. That is, if the asset price exceeds the strike price, the call writer must pay out, it's a loss, must pay out the difference between the asset value and the strike price. If the asset price is less than the strike price, then the call writer does not have to pay a thing, and the payoff is 0. The profit that the call writer receives is this payoff plus the premium that the call writer receives from the call holder when the call writer initially issues the call. To see this graphically, let's plot the payout and the profit from a call option in a particular case, for a particular example. And in this example, we've set the strike price to be 100 and the premium on the call to be $5. So in this case, the exercise price is 100, and in the case where the asset price is below the strike price, then the payout to the call is 0. So nothing gets paid out, and so the payout that the call holder receives is 0. However, if the underlying asset price exceeds the strike price, so it's over here, then the call holder will wish to exercise the call option. And in that case, if the call holder exercises the option, the call holder receives the difference between the asset value and the strike price, receives this difference. So the payout goes up 1 for 1 with the asset price, if the asset price exceeds the strike price. Now the profit that for purchasing the call is then just the payout minus the premium paid. So in this case, the profit is just the payout minus the $5 that the call holder had to pay to the call writer when the call holder initially purchased the call from the writer. So in this case, we say that the call holder will wish to exercise the option if the underlying asset value exceeds the strike price, that is, exceeds $100, though the call holder will only receive a positive profit if the underlying asset exceeds the strike price plus the premium. That is, they only receive a positive profit if the underlying asset exceeds $105. So the payout for the call writer is then just the mirror image of the payout for the call holder. So for the call writer, again, the same example. We're going to set the strike price. We set the strike price to 100 and the premium to $5. And in this case, if the underlying asset price is below, the strike price is below $100, then the call writer does not have to pay out anything to the call holder and simply receives the difference in profits between receives the premium, the $5 premium as part of the profit. However, if the terminal price exceeds the strike price, exceeds $100, then we know the call holder will exercise the call, and the call writer will have to pay out the difference between the underlying asset price and the exercise price to the holder. The writer will still receive a positive profit as long as the asset price is below the exercise price plus the premium. But if the exercise price exceeds the exercise price plus the premium, in this case $105, then the profits will be negative. And in the case of a call option, the payout and profit is actually, it's not bounded below. It can, as long as the price of the underlying asset rises, the payout will decline for the call writer. So to price the call, we want to use a simple single period binomial model. We're going to, and then we're going to make a contingent claims argument on how to price this call. So suppose, let's do an example first, then we'll do the general case. So suppose that a bond is worth $95 this period. And then it can take on one of two possible values next period. So we'll say that there's an up state or a high price, low yield state, in which case the bond takes the value of $105. And then there's a down state or a low price, high yield state where the bond takes a value of $85. Now suppose we were to write a call option on this bond, so the underlying security that this call is going to be written on is this bond. We're going to write a call option with a strike price of $100. So in this case, for this call, this particular call, in the high price, low yield state, or in the up state, the value of the call, the payoff of the call, will be the difference between the price, the bond price, and the exercise price. So it'll be the difference between $105 and $100, or $5. In the low price, high yield state, since the price of the underlying asset, the price of the bond, is below the strike price, the payoff to the call will be $0. Now what we want to do is we want to figure out what the value of the call is in the initial period. So we're going to try to solve for C. And to do so, we're going to use contingent claims. We're going to use a no arbitrage argument. And what we're going to do by doing that, we're going to create two alternative portfolios. So we're going to do it in two very closely related ways. Actually, in some sense, it's the same way, but we can think about it as two separate arguments to price the value of this call. So the first way is to create what's called a replicating portfolio. That is, we're going to use the asset, the underlying asset, the bond, plus a risk-free security. We're going to create a portfolio with a bond and a risk-free security to replicate the payoff of the option, and then argue that the cost of this portfolio must equal the cost of the option. Okay, so that's one way we're going to do it. A second way to do it is to create what's called a hedging portfolio. That is, we're going to use the underlying asset, the bond, plus the option, the option, to create a risk-free portfolio. And then we're going to argue that the return on this hedging portfolio must equal the risk-free rate. Okay, so let's do the replicating portfolio, and let's continue with our simple example. So what we're going to want to do is create a portfolio of the underlying asset, which is the bond in this case, and a risk-free loan that's going to mimic the payoff of our option. So we're going to let delta denote the number of shares of the underlying asset in our portfolio, and L denote the amount of this risk-free loan in our portfolio. So let's assume, for the sake of our example, that the risk-free borrowing rate is 1%. So we can borrow and lend freely at 1% in our risk-free loan. So then what we want to do is we want to use this portfolio to replicate the payoffs to the option. So what's the payoff? What are the prices so let's think about what the prices are in the high price, high yield state. That's our first equation. Well, in the high price, high yield state, the payoff to our bond is $105. That's the price of the bond. And then we're going to receive 1.01 or 1% gross return on our risk-free borrowing. And that's going to need to equal $5 in the high price, low yield state to replicate the payoff of the option in the high price, low yield state. Okay. The second equation right here is going to replicate the payoff of the call option in the low price, high yield state. In this state, the price of the underlying bond is $85, and again, we'll receive 1% interest or 1.01 gross interest on our risk-free loan. And in this second state, the payoff to the option is $0. So we have a system of two equations and two unknowns. Our two unknowns are the shares in the underlying asset, delta, and L, the amount of the risk-free borrowing and lending. And if we solve these two equations for our two unknowns, we get that delta is equal to 0.25 or 1/4. So we're going to want to buy 1/4 of the bond. And in this case, our risk-free lending is negative 21.0396. That is, what we're going to want to do is borrow the risk-free loan and use those proceeds to buy 1/4 of the bond. So then the value or the premium of the call option in the initial period is going to be, well, we're going to buy 1/4 of the bond, so that the bond price is $95 in the initial period. We're buying 1/4 of it, and then we're going to borrow $21.04 or 0.0396. If we add those two costs up, we get $2.71. So that's the value or the premium of the call option in the first period. Now, in general, if the price of the underlying security is S in period 1, and it will either go up to 1 plus U in the high state or the up state, and 1 plus D times S in the low state, then we can write our two equations in this general form, which is 1 plus U times S times delta plus 1 plus R times the risk-free borrowing equals the value of the call option in the up state, or the first state. And then the second equation is 1 plus D, the value of the stock, the underlying asset in the down state, times the number of shares of the underlying asset, plus 1 plus R times the risk-free borrowing is equal to the value of the call in the second or the down state. And the general equation, the general solution to these two equations, or these two unknowns, is delta, which is the difference in the coupon value between the high and the low state, and the difference in the value of the underlying security in the initial period. And then the loan is given by that second term. Delta, this delta is going to often be is known as the hedge ratio. That value of delta is the hedge ratio for reasons that we'll see shortly. So in this case, the value of the call option is then just S times delta, the value of the underlying asset, times delta, plus L, the amount of the risk-free borrowing and lending. Now, if we define P as R minus D over U minus D, we'll define that term. That term's known as the risk-neutral probability. Then we can write the value of the call option so the value of the call option is equal to the probability that the upstate occurs times the value of the coupon in the upstate plus the probability that the downstate occurs times the value of the coupon in the downstate divided by 1 plus the risk-free rate. Now, so that's the replicating portfolio. Alternatively, we could compute what's called a hedging portfolio. This we consider the writer of the call. Now, as we pointed out, the writer of the call faces unlimited downside risk. So we might think that the writer of the call might want to hedge their position. So you think they might want to purchase delta shares of the asset, of the underlying asset, to hedge their position with the call. And so in this case, the portfolio would include one short position in the call. So they've issued a single call, call it one short position, and then delta shares of the asset. So they're going to be short on the call and long on the underlying asset. And we're going to want to combine these two securities to create a risk-free security, to create a risk-free portfolio. That is, we're going to want the payoff in the low yield state, or in the high price low yield state, to equal the payoff in the high yield low price state. That is, we want the payoff to be 105 times the share of the asset minus the payoff of the call to equal $85 times the shares of the asset. And if we solve this one equation for one unknown, we're going to get delta to equal 1/4. In other words, we can perfectly hedge this short position on the call by turning around and buying delta shares of the underlying asset. That is why this delta is often called the hedge ratio. Then we can argue under no arbitrage, the holding period return on this portfolio must be the risk-free rate, where that's 1% in our example. So in this case, the cost of this portfolio, of purchasing this portfolio, is you're going to be long in the underlying asset, which is delta times $95. So delta is the shares, so at the price of $95, minus the premium on the call. So that is, you're long in the asset and you're short in the call. So you issue the call. So you sell the call, receive the premium, and you go and turn around and buy delta shares of the underlying asset. Then the payoff of this portfolio is going to be $85 times, so the payoff in the second period is going to be $85 times delta, which is 0.25, or 21.25, or 105 times 1/4, which is delta, minus the $5 that will need to be paid out from the writer to the call holder. Again, that's $21.5. So the holding period return of this portfolio is just going to be, it has to equal, we're arguing that it has to be equal to the risk-free rate. So there's the risk-free rate. And so the holding period return is just the value, the payout next period, minus what it costs to purchase this portfolio, divided by what it costs to purchase this portfolio. And if we solve this one equation with this one unknown for the premium on the call, we get $2.71, exactly the same result that we got under the replicating portfolio. And this makes sense because if S times delta plus L replicates the payoff of the call, then it must be that S times delta minus C must replicate the risk-free loan. So it makes sense. Okay, so what's a callable bond? Well, this is actually quite simple now. So a callable bond is a bond that grants the issuer of the bond, or the borrower, the right to redeem the bond after a preset date in the future at a specific preset strike price. So now this call feature is an example of what's called an embedded derivative. That is, it's a derivative that's not traded separately from the security itself. So a callable bond can be decomposed into two parts. One is the non-callable bond part, V0, and two, the value of the call option. Well, in your previous lectures with Tom on bond pricing, we figured out how to price a non-callable bond. So that we know how to do. From the previous 20 minutes, we know how to price a call. And so then to sort of price a callable bond, well, the value of a callable bond is just simply the difference between the non-callable bond and the call option. Because when the Treasury issues a callable bond, what it does is it sells part one and buys part two. So it issues a non-callable bond and in turn buys a call option. So the value of a callable bond is pretty simple. You compute the value of the non-callable bond, and then you compute the value of the call option and take the difference. Now, one question is, if a callable bond always sells less than a non-callable bond, why would the Treasury ever issue a callable bond when it's going to collect less revenue with a callable bond? Well, it's got to believe that Treasury must believe that it's borrowing, at higher rates, and the yields will eventually fall, and that bond prices will rise. We'll see whether Treasury will issue callable bonds during the Civil War, during World War I, and during World War II, and during the post-war period. So we'll see if and when those bets pay off. Well, that's the end of the lecture. Thanks so much, and we'll get back to doing some history shortly.